Okay, folks are continuing to join us, but we'll get things started. I know everybody's on their lunch hour, so we want to make sure that folks get back in a timely fashion. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank our series sponsor, the Job Gym. They've been an amazing partner to us over the years for all of our employment and training needs. I'd like to introduce our good friend, Amanda Shannon from the Job Gym, to say a few words.
Thank you, Dolores, and thank you for those kind words. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Amanda Shannon. I'm the employer specialist with Job Gym, and we're very pleased to sponsor today's session. We all know the economic landscape is constantly evolving. There's internal and outside influence. There's new industries emerging. Others are transforming. Workforce needs are shifting. And staying ahead of those changes is essential for employers, job seekers, and community partners who are planning for the future. At Job Gym, that's exactly what we focus on every day. We help individuals build skills, discover new opportunities, and move confidently toward their career goals. We also partner with employers to support hiring, training, and workforce development, helping businesses grow with the talent they need. Today's economic update provides critical context for all of that work. So these insights will help us better understand where our region is heading and how we can align our efforts to support a strong, resilient labor market. Thank you to Blake and the Regional Economic Development Team for sharing your expertise, and to the Chamber for providing us this opportunity for all of us to connect. And thank you everyone for being here. We hope you find today's session informative, relevant, and energizing.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. All right. Well, today we welcome Blake Landry. He's the manager of economic research and analysis for the Niagara Region Economic Development, where he leads the team responsible for monitoring and interpreting the region's economic, industrial, and business trends. We just call him the rock star of data for Niagara. Blake will be providing us with a snapshot of where Niagara stands today and what emerging factors may shape the year ahead. So some great timely information. The format for our session will be as follows. You can submit your questions throughout the presentation through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll address all of the questions at the end of the presentation. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Blake. Take it away, Blake.
Thank you very much, Dolores. I'd just like to thank the sponsor again, Job Gym, as well as South Niagara Chambers of Commerce. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to share the information. As mentioned, what I plan to do is provide you with an update of what's happening in the regional economy from a statistical perspective. And again, I'm happy to take questions afterwards and happy to make this interactive. So let's begin. So I'd like to start just by providing some context. So things are moving quite rapidly these days in terms of the economy. So first, let's talk just briefly about the national economy. So Canada, our GDP contracted by about 0.4% by Q2 2025. So this is the largest pandemic quarterly contraction in 9 years. So it is definitely an interesting time. So the declines have been driven by lower export values and reduced business and investor confidence brought on by US trade policy. So in my presentation, a lot of the impacts that I'll be discussing are directly related to what's happening with the United States and the tariff policies. So that being said, household spending and business inventory buildup has helped offset some of these losses to date. Employment growth has stalled in January to August. However, the economy actually added 60,000 jobs in September, and the October results were also quite strong. So we actually gained jobs in October as well, nationally. So despite these gains, the Bank of Canada still cut interest rates due to a weaker trade outlook and trade uncertainty. So again, it's the trade that's really impacting that confidence in the economy nationally. So that being said, inflation rose to 2.4% in September, but then it declined again to 2.2% in October. So inflation is still under control, still within the Bank of Canada's target range of 1 to 3%. However, the Bank of Canada indicated they don't intend on doing any more cuts, that fiscal policy is going to have to essentially get us out of this issue that we're dealing with at this point. So that being said, Niagara is also facing global economic pressures given the U.S. tariffs and the global geopolitical climate. Employment growth has stalled here as well within the last couple of months, and the sectors that are most effective from a period of April till now are really transportation and warehousing, manufacturing, construction. So a lot of those primary goods producing industries. And now we're seeing a bit of a ripple effect into the service oriented industries such as healthcare, social assistance, accommodation, and food services, as well as wholesale trade. So we're starting to see this kind of ripple through the economy, and I'll get into this in more detail. So non-residential investment in Niagara has also risen sharply, which is great for long-term prospects. And then lastly, the outlook for 2026 includes some uncertainty, but you will see in what I'm going to present that it's not doom and gloom. We're actually in a very good position going forward. So I'd like to just start with the most basic indicator of population growth. So as you can see here, Niagara has experienced substantial historical population growth over the last 4 years or so. So this would be about 8.4% growth over 2021. And Niagara outpaced both Canada and Ontario in terms of population growth. However, whereas Ontario and Canada was mostly driven by immigration to the country, Niagara has been driven by provincial migration. So people within Ontario actually moving to Niagara, in particular the GTA and Hamilton. So that's really driving our population growth. Now we're with some of the changes in immigration policy, we can expect to see some softer population growth. So you can see the forecast for 2025. Some of that growth will be cooled a little, although we're still expecting, a substantial amount of growth. It won't be as much as if those immigration-oriented policies were not in place. So as we move on, the consumer price index is the typical measurement of inflation. So as you can see here, these are year over year percentage change in the CPI. So as mentioned, it got pretty high around August, September to about 2.5%, but now we're at about 2.2%. And that was driven, the decline has been driven by basically a decrease in the cost of gas and what that means for general costs of goods in the economy. So inflation is under control at this point. I mentioned that the Bank of Canada doesn't intend to lower interest rates any lower, and that's directly related to what could happen to inflation if they did continue to lower interest rates. It could go above the 3% kind of 1 to 3% target range. So that's why we're in a pretty good spot with inflation, and we're not going to see them make any more interest rate changes. Plus, we can expect a level of inflation to continue to decrease. So the forecast through 2026 is that it could drop to as low as 1.4%. So that is pretty good in terms of managing inflation in the regional economy. So now I'm going to talk quickly about gross domestic product. So gross domestic product is the basically the end value of all goods and services produced in the regional economy. So the GDP figures I have on this slide are all adjusted for inflation. So it can show you basically the GDP growth has been quite strong. But you can see where some of the tariff talks align with the dates in the graph. Basically, just the confidence that basically shook in our economy was enough to affect our GDP growth. So we did notice basically softer growth in Q2 and Q3 of 2025, and that's directly related to a lot of the conversations around the tariffs and the impacts of the tariffs in the Canadian and Niagara in particular economy. So obviously these are all Niagara figures. But as the trade environment stabilizes, like we really hope that it stabilizes, because I suspect we'll see very strong growth when we have that kind of trade confidence back in the economy. So Niagara is a trading economy, so it really impacts like our basic economic progress here. Nominally speaking, so not adjusted for inflation, Niagara's economy is valued at about $26 billion. So now I'm going to talk about wages and salaries. So these are in thousands of dollars. So these are essentially average wages and salaries per employee in Niagara. So as you can see, Niagara has lagged Ontario, and this is historical. Niagara has always been like a lower cost jurisdiction for employers, and we've benefited that regionally. However, what's happening is that the labor market is now extra regional. The labor market now goes from the border all the way to Oshawa, all the way to Waterloo. So we pull labor from a lot of different areas. So as I mentioned, historically our wages and salaries were lower, but we can expect that to increase over time, albeit at a very gradual rate. We are still very dependent on service-oriented sectors that are related to tourism and hospitality, and those typically don't pay the best. So it actually lowers the average a little bit. But as mentioned, a lot of people are moving to this area. They're moving to this area. They may already have good jobs in the extra regional economy, and over time, that'll really improve kind of the average wages and salaries here. But at this time, it is lower than Ontario, and that's not necessarily bad, because when we're working with investors, this is actually a selling feature for Niagara. They understand they need to pay living wages, and their employees need to afford to live, but it still helps our value proposition to demonstrate that Niagara is a lower cost jurisdiction in the province. The same can really be said about household disposable income per capita. So this is essentially the income that is left over after taxes and all those other mandatory deductions. So as you can see here, again, Niagara has lagged Ontario. You can see here in Q3 2025, that's a direct impact of the tariffs on our economy. So as mentioned, we saw some immediate impact in sectors like manufacturing, transportation and warehousing, wholesale trade, like those that are very dependent on trade. However, you can see a rebound that is projected through 2026. Housing prices is one of those leading economic indicators. So when I'm assessing what's really happening in the economy, I really look at kind of housing prices for that early indication, because they're released monthly, and it really really highlights kind of some of the consumer confidence that exists out there in the region. That, and along with kind of employment and labor force stuff that I'll talk about. But I'm just going to talk here briefly about housing. So what I have here is the HPI, so the Housing Price Index price for a composite home. So this is an average across kind of the detached, single detached, all those types of dwelling units. And it shows that Niagara is actually substantially lower, almost $200,000 lower than Ontario as a whole. So the average kind of housing price in Ontario is about $791,000. In Niagara, it's $609,000. So although that is a high amount, it's historically quite high for Niagara, we're still cheaper than Ontario and a lot of the other jurisdictions in Ontario that we compete for investment and jobs. So again, this is a good selling feature for Niagara. However, it is also a barometer in what's happening in the economy. And we can tell that kind of that consumer and business confidence is really not that strong, in that there are, the houses and properties are selling for less because people are unsure in terms of what the economic future looks like. So similarly, talk about retail sales. So coming out of the pandemic, we had very strong retail sales growth, predominantly related to pent-up discretionary income. So that's all the money after the mandatory living costs that people have to spend on, recreation and other activities and goods within the economy. So coming out of the pandemic, we had a lot of pent-up discretionary income, and that really boosted retail sales. Then it cooled off because at the same time that boosted inflation to about 8%. So that impacted people's basically purchasing power. But then you can see throughout 2024, 2025, very strong retail sales growth. So kind of rebounded again. But as you can see in Q3 2025, with the tariff policies, again, that kind of rocked the confidence of consumers, and then retail sales dropped. However, as you can see, the projections show strong prospects for retail sales. But again, this is really contingent on basically stabilizing our trade relationship with the United States and bringing back that business and consumer confidence. Now I'm going to talk about investment in construction. So this is another really good indicator that gets provided monthly from Statistics Canada. So this graph is not great. All of this is adjusted for inflation. So these are on constant dollars. So this is real change. And what we can see here is really a declining trend in terms of investment in residential building construction. This is all also seasonally adjusted. So seasonal variations are removed from this particular data. And what we can see here is a declining investment in construction, in residential in particular. So that would have started with the higher interest rates. The Bank of Canada raised the interest rates to manage inflation. So that was a self-imposed kind of cooling of the economy, which had a direct impact on people buying residential units. It made housing more expensive. So, houses weren't being completed at the same rate. And we can see this kind of continuing on because from that came the tariffs. And then that is now an issue. So no one who works in a tariff exposed sector will want to go and make that investment in a new house, in building something new, just because we don't know what the next few months are going to look like from a trade perspective. So this has been declining. This is not just a characteristic of Niagara, but it's symptomatic across all of Ontario. So it is really provincial wide. Now let's talk about commercial, industrial, and institutional investment. Now this has gone way better than residential. So coming out of the pandemic, investment in commercial construction was very, very low. Like it was almost dead. People were not investing in building construction in commercial. That was because of the impacts of the pandemic on things like retail trade, office space, how people use office space, the amount of office space people were using. So that really impacted whether or not construction companies and developers were investing in commercial construction. However, as you can see over the past year, it's come back quite strongly and it's been on a quite positive trajectory. So this trend started happening before the talk around tariffs and that sort of thing. And this has continued despite kind of the talk around tariffs. However, this sector really serves as kind of a domestic market. So a lot of the talks around tariffs, although it affects the economy, not necessarily going to affect some of these projects in the long term. So a lot of these are ongoing. Now I'd like to talk about industrial. So industrial has remained very strong over the last number of years, and it's going to be very strong going into the future. So we have many multi-year construction projects underway in the industrial sector. So being in South Niagara, that part of the region is benefiting by far the most from this activity, with major investments by Asahi Kasei, Young Bunzlauer, Siltep Corp, Abatement Technologies. I could go on. There's about 35 ongoing projects, and most of them are in South Niagara. So it's really good in that, our value proposition is recognized. South Niagara is very well recognized for being able to help facilitate these industrial investments. And this is going to continue on into the future, despite some of the uncertainty caused by trade. A lot of these companies have 50-year plans. They're investing for the long-term future and are not phased too much by what the kind of conversations around tariffs. So we've spoken to a lot of them, and they're all, all of them are moving forward, and we can expect this activity to happen for the next 2 or 3 years at minimum. And just talking about our pipeline, so we've worked with a lot of these companies or coming to the region. Our pipeline is still full, but people are in a holding pattern at this point, waiting to see what happens with the United States trade policy and global trade before some of the new projects get announced and construction begins on those. However, we're in a strong place, and investment is happening here in a big way, especially in the industrial sector. Lastly, I'm going to talk about institutional. So this is government investment in construction that doesn't really follow the markets as much as residential, commercial, and institutional, in that this is really, if we need a facility, we're going to build it, whether or not the market conditions are conducive or not. So projects like the South Niagara Hospital is one. We recently completed the West Lincoln Memorial Hospital. So those are some of the projects that would be reflected in this data. And again, it really ebbs and flows just depending on kind of the need to build some of these facilities. And it's not really an indication of the market. However, you can see over the last year, it has been strong, and there is a lot of investment in terms of government building construction or institutional. That could be healthcare, that could be education, that could be public administration. So any of those types of buildings would be captured under this sector. Now I'm going to talk about international trade. So unfortunately, I'm not able to get very current data here. It's just the nature of the beast. Statistics Canada doesn't release. I won't get the full 2024 values for another couple months, and then the 2025 values until almost the end of 2026. So it makes it really difficult to kind of plan around trade and really understand how the tariffs are impacting our trade. But what I can tell you is that in 2022, Niagara's exports reached the highest value they'd really been at since we started collecting this data. So they reached about $8.2 billion. Imports also reached a high point at about $3.1 billion, but that left us with a trade surplus of about $5.1 billion. About 80% of that trade goes to the United States, and about 80% of that comes from the manufacturing sector, with about 20% agriculture and about 10% wholesale trade. So a lot of this is driven by manufacturing. I have not been able to get the full 2024 values yet, but as you can see, for import, but I have the export values, and what you can see is a drop from about 8.2 billion to about 6.6 billion. So we've seen a drop in trade values. And this started before Trump was elected and there was any talk around the tariffs. So we're already seeing a bit of a loosening around trade. I think coming out of the pandemic, things were so hot. The economy was just pumping on all cylinders, and it really created a lot of international markets for some of these companies. But that has kind of softened a little bit. However, historically, 6.6 billion is still very strong, historically speaking. Prior to 2021, we hovered around 4 billion for many years. So we're still in a good position from a trade perspective. In terms of business count, so what I show you here are the total number of businesses in Niagara with employees on payroll, as well as those businesses that don't have employees. So the businesses without employees, they actually file taxes and they generate revenue of over $30,000, which is how they're included in this particular data set. So they're legitimate businesses, but they're typically your self-employed businesses that are in that particular no employees category. But what you can see here is just steady growth with businesses with employees. So you can see, regular growth over 100, almost 100 firms a year. So pretty strong. And then businesses without employees, again, we see strong growth there. And those are usually your startups and your self-employed individuals. So it's really an indication that the entrepreneurial culture in Niagara is still strong, and that people are starting businesses and operating businesses for their livelihood. So it's good news generally that the business counts have remained strong despite some of this kind of activity in the economy. Excuse me. Now I'd like just to discuss labor force employment and other labor indicators. So as you could see here, the dark line is Niagara's labor force, and then the light line is our employment. So there's always going to be more labor force than employment. And the people who are unemployed but in the labor force, they actually show up in the unemployment rate. So as you can see here, Niagara's labor force actually reached a historical high of about 266,000 people as of Q2 2025. But as you can see by Q3, with the talks around the tariffs, some of the uncertainty that generated around those talks impacted our labor force. It also impacted our employment as well. So you can see labor force and employment kind of mirror each other. There's usually always people that are, unemployed, but still participating in the labor force. And the tariff talks, basically, you could see people left the labor force, and you could also see people losing their jobs, essentially. However, we're at about 241,000, and over the last couple of months, it's really stabilized. We haven't really lost any major employment over the last 2 months. So from April to about August, we saw some major declines in employment and labor force. But from about September to current, the most current data was actually just released a couple of weeks ago. But it has stabilized. So that's a great sign. And I really think that our existing trade relationship, the USMCA, is really kind of saving our bacon at this point. So if we compare Niagara to other jurisdictions like Windsor, Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, or Oshawa, we are far better off than some of those regions that are directly impacted by things like the steel tariffs as well as the auto tariffs. So those are really hard on those other regions. But Niagara is actually in a place now where we're quite diversified. So having gone through the Great Recession, a level of diversification happened there. We were better off years after that. Now coming through the pandemic, we've had some of our major learnings coming through that. And now I think we're in a pretty good place, despite some of the challenges that we see kind of in the global economic environment. And that's really reflected in the unemployment rate as well. So you could see Niagara, we reached about 8.1%. That was essentially self-imposed with higher interest rates through the Bank of Canada. But as the interest rates came down, you could see the unemployment rate really came down to about 6.2%, which is quite low compared to Ontario. And now we're hovering at about 7% compared to about 7.8% right now for Ontario. So we're still faring better than Ontario from an unemployment rate perspective. And again, I attribute this to Niagara having done a good job really diversifying the economy, especially within the last 10 years. It's really apparent, especially if you look at kind of the employment data by sector. It's really apparent that our economy is now supported by a multitude of sectors as opposed to just single sectors such as in the past. In terms of participation rate, so Niagara's has always been lower than Ontario. So this essentially shows us the percentage of the population that is participating in the labor force, like in the economy. However, we have an older demographic in Niagara, and although there's younger people moving here from Toronto and Hamilton, it's going to take a number of years for that to actually change some of the demographic characteristics from a high level. So it really is quite volatile depending on what happens in the economy. And you can see as soon as some of the trade-oriented issues started to arise, a lot of people just stopped participating in the labor force. So that could be people that are working in trade-exposed sectors. That could be people of an older age that have decided to just leave the labor force altogether. It's a combination of all those things, but it is more volatile in Niagara. And again, it has more to do with demographics than it actually has to do with um, like employment prospects here. So in conclusion, Niagara's economy continues to be resilient under external pressures. Niagara's GDP growth remains slow, but the region is supported by population growth, business growth, and ICI investment. So despite some of the slowing of the economy, some of those other business activities remain and are still strong. The labor force indicators have softened but remain relatively stable. So comparing to the Great Recession, where unemployment rate was 12 or 13%, or compared to the pandemic, like our economy is still relatively stable and we're not losing any major chunks of jobs at this particular time. Niagara is well positioned to adapt to ongoing challenges when compared to historical economic restructuring through diversification. So I mentioned the Great Recession after '09, mentioned the pandemic, and I've been doing this work since then. And what I've noticed is that every time we have a major disruption in Niagara, we come out more resilient, higher diversified, and better positioned to take advantage of the future going forward. So going through kind of this trade situation, I believe we'll be stronger for it when we get to the other side, when things stabilize. I really think that when that stabilizes, things are going to come back really strong. And then what we can do for the future is really to continue focus on economic development in all facets, really, workforce development, innovation and productivity enhancements, as well as strategic infrastructure investments. So these are really critical. And when looking at the recent federal budget, so it's really aligned with these what we need to be doing in the future. So the federal budget really is meant to encourage business investment. So it includes a lot of support for infrastructure to facilitate trade and diversification. So helping us access new markets. So I mentioned the US is about 80% of Niagara's export market. Well, we need to get that a little bit lower. And you cannot replace the US market, but you can start and you can look to diversify and it will still benefit us. So the budget also looks at investment in hard infrastructure, so highways, bridges, ports, electrical grids, digital corridors, defense, housing, and in other initiatives to boost productivity. Tariff relief is also a major component of the current budget. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity there for companies to take advantage of some of these opportunities. So it isn't more spending. However, I believe it's necessary at this point in order to offset some of those impacts that the tariffs are having on our national and regional economy. And I think Niagara is really well positioned to take advantage of this federal budget since we're such a major trade player in Canada. One thing I didn't mention is that about 10% of all trade between Canada and the United States comes through Niagara. So we're critically important. And I suspect we'll be successful at landing a lot of these new investments to support the infrastructure here in Niagara. Lastly, here is my name and my contact information. So this is basically a whirlwind in terms of an economic update. But if you have any questions, or if you want to break any of that stuff down, or you need any other data to support what you're doing in your businesses or your lives, I'm happy to support you. And here is my email address. It's best to email me with research inquiries. And that said, I'm happy to take any questions at this time.
All right, that was great. Great presentation, Blake. Thank you so much. We'll keep an eye to see if anybody submits any questions. I had a number of questions and you answered most of them through your presentation, so well done. But I do have two that I just keep wondering about. So the first is really around housing. And you know, we all know that there was a lot of people here in Niagara that bought high. You know, there were all of the bidding wars and all of that going on. And, you know, now a lot of these folks are in a position where they're renewing mortgages and it has become very, very tight for them. What do you see happening with that? Do you think that we'll be in a position where we're going to see a lot of inventory of resale coming on the market in Niagara? What are your thoughts on that?
I suspect that will happen. However, the interest rates have come down, so there is a little bit of relief there. So it really depends exactly when you renew your mortgage. And although the policy rate has come down, I'm noticing that the bank rates are not coming down as much. So although the Bank of Canada is trying to alleviate these headwinds, the banks are not following suit. I really feel for those people who needed homes at that point and bought, and then now they're in you know, a very tough situation. And ultimately, if you can't afford what you purchased, you know, the consequence is kind of losing that investment. So I don't mean to be negative about it, but ultimately, that's not a good sign for those particular people. And I'm not an expert in housing. That's a whole other animal
Yeah.
that I don't do much because I'm really focused on kind of the macro economy in industries. But that being said, I do see that being a major challenge in the future. And I see that the federal government in the budget is trying to make investments to encourage housing development, to try and, you know, bring prices down. However, if you bought already and you're beholden to that lender, I think you're just in a really tough spot at that point. And I really don't have any great answers for that question in that circumstance.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was around the workforce people. So we see a lot of people moving to Niagara from the GTA and other parts of Ontario. How many of those people, and I don't know if you have the answer to this, but do we know as those people relocate to Niagara, are many of those finding employment here in Niagara, or do we have a lot of commuters? Are they commuting back to the GTA and other parts of Ontario for their jobs?
So again, that's something we can figure out. Like the data does exist. I don't have it in front of me,
Okay.
but I have looked at it in the past. And what I can tell you is that the demographics that are moving here are people 0 to 4 years old and 35 to 45 years old. And a lot of them do work in Hamilton and the GTA. So yes, many of them are living in Niagara, but they're working outside of Niagara. However, that's still beneficial to Niagara because, you know, that employment income, their discretionary income will be spent, a lot of it, most of it will be spent in Niagara. So it does benefit our economy. It will improve kind of what our salaries and wages look like because, like I mentioned, the labor force is becoming extra regional, or let's say intra-regional, in that, you know, when I'm dealing with investors, they're interested in the labor force within a 100-kilometer radius, you know. So a lot of these investors understand that they're sourcing their labor force from Niagara to Waterloo to Oshawa, you know, and hopefully convincing these people to move in Niagara. So I think it's a combination of a lot of these things. It's not one or the other. It's a big combination. And if you looked at the data, you'd really notice that there's all kinds of like little findings that you can find among demographics, among industries and sectors, So if I work in a service oriented sector, there are more opportunities for work, remote or hybrid work environments than if you work in primary or goods producing sectors like manufacturing or construction or agriculture. So we really need those primary sectors to they actually serve as our economic base. They support all the service producing sectors. So you need those. But I think, if we looked at it from a sector perspective, people are moving here and working in those sectors. They would be living here, but you're going to get more people in hybrid and different kind of work arrangements, especially from like the Toronto and the Hamilton, for instance. So that being said, simple answer, it's really a combination, but it's actually a younger demographic, which is positive.
Yeah, and I think that is very positive. What we're hearing from some of our members in our different communities in South Niagara is that as we attract people from the GTA and other parts of the province, they are commuting, they're not working in the community, and that does impact other things within our community. We're not seeing, volunteers coming out or people participating in community programs, events, initiatives because they're not working here. And so that has an impact on that piece of life in Niagara. And so, as opportunities continue to grow here in Niagara with employment, that might be something that might shift.
That's a great insight. Like we really have to do better at helping integrate some of these people
Yeah.
into the economy. And like I've done a lot of work with this with foreign trained professionals, like immigrants who are engineers and that sort of thing, helping them get engaged in the economy. So I've done that as a volunteer for many years. But I think it's also necessary now for just people moving into the area and getting them engaged, because that's, if we want to maximize their economic impact, and we want them spending their discretionary income here. So it's a very good insight in terms of what we could do to benefit from that particular trend.
Yeah. Yeah. I see we do have a question from Jordan. Blake, do you have any data specifically around the demographics for Niagara? We often talked about the aging population, but do we know exactly what that looks like in terms of numbers? I guess you sort of alluded to that in
So we know exactly what that looks like. So Statistics Canada does an incredible job of making this data available, as well as improving it every year. So we know more about who lives in Niagara than we ever have in history. So yes, that information is widely available. However, it's not easily digestible. So I mean that when you want to do that type of analysis, you really have to be adept at working with data. So that's one way they can improve, and they have been by making dashboards and things. But if you really want to jump into the minutia, you really have to understand how to work with those data tables and StatCan in particular. But I do that. So happy to share that information if that's something you wanted.
And I'm sure that that's the data that's driving some of the non-residential investments that we're making. If we have an aging population, maybe it's more, senior care facilities. If we have a growing population where it's 0 to 4, that's where we're building new schools. So that data is really helping our political leaders make some of those tough decisions as to where dollars are being allocated.
Certainly. And so I mentioned that's the demographic that's coming here, but I also mentioned that we still have an aging demographic. We're still one of the oldest regions in Canada, like next to Victoria, BC. So there is still an opportunity in services and things to cater to that older demographic. And those people tend to have more money, a lot of money. So I don't want people to not recognize that as an opportunity. It's just that it's both happening at the same time.
Yeah. And that older demographic, again, getting them more engaged in the community. When we talk about volunteers, when we talk about, support and things that we need within the community, many of those folks are retired. They might have a little more time than, working families. And that's another group that we really should be working on to kind of entice them and get them a little more engaged in the different things that we have within the communities here in Niagara. Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Any other? Oh, I think there might be. Okay. Another question. With an expected decrease in international students, is there a possibility that many rental properties would become available for sale, driving housing prices down? That's a good
So
question.
that is a great question, and I believe that is going to happen, and I believe that was part of the impetus behind the policy, because that was putting a lot of extra pressure on the rental units. So we're actually going to find out what's happening in rental very soon, because CMHC releases their rental survey after October. They do it every October. So this month we're going to find out what's kind of happening in the rental market. So that'll be very interesting to see. So we'll pretty soon we'll have some good intelligence on that. But I do agree. So that is going to improve housing availability, especially as it pertains to housing that would be, more applicable for lower income people. However, it will take some spending out of the economy, will take some people, part-time workers and such, out of the economy. So maybe some employers would have used those people in the past. It also has resulted in a loss of jobs in educational institutions. So that is also shown up in the data. So I don't attribute that to tariffs. I attribute that to immigration policy and international student policy. But there has been hundreds of jobs lost in post-secondary education in Niagara as a direct result of that policy. So that is a great question, because this is really playing out in the data right now. And I do think it will have some improvement, but it will also have some negative impact as well, because some employers depend on that labor supply. And again, some people depend on jobs servicing those people. So it's a catch-22, but I think it's necessary at this particular point.
Great. Thank you. Okay, let's see. I think that's it. I think we've answered all of the questions. Thank you so much, Blake. You are always a wealth of information. We always love having you. Lots of great insight. Like I said, the rock star of data for Niagara. So thank you so much. We will share the recording from today, and if anybody needs any information, you can either reach out to us or to Blake directly, and we'll get you the details that you need. Our next session will take place, our next Lunch and Learn will take place on January 20th. So you'll receive all of the session details in your What's Up Wednesday. So make sure you look for that. We hope to see you all at our holiday mingle on December 3rd. Hope you enjoyed the session. Thanks again, Blake and Amanda from the Job Gym. Have yourselves a great afternoon, folks. Take care.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.